This is Boxing Talk 8576. I want to talk about Tommy Morrison. Many people know Tommy Morrison as the guy that played on Rocky, that Rocky was training in Rocky 5. I'm a big, huge Rocky film, gore. I love the Rocky films. I always watched them like all the time growing up. And every time it came on HBO or Showtime, I watched it because back then HBO and Showtime used to play things like constantly, especially the big box office movies. They played sometimes they played them 2 times a day. So I remember when they were making the movie that it was a guy that's going to be in the movie that was a current boxer, and I was like, oh, he's gonna use a current boxer in the movie. Oh, that's interesting. So because I knew he used Mr. T. Mr. T wasn't a boxer. Mr. T was like more in the tough man competitions. He won tough man competitions. Because living in Chicago, that's where Mr. T is from. Living in Chicago, I grew up in the projects where Mr. T lived. He lived actually, I lived in Stateway, and he lived in Robert Taylor's, like right across the street from where I lived. And I remember, I was friends with some of his nephews, and they used to always talk about Mr. T. But ironically enough, Tommy Morrison grew up. He was fighting in tough man competitions himself. He said he won 21 of 20 matches of tough man competitions growing up. And, I watched the 30 for 30 because there's some things that in there I didn't know about Tommy Morrison. I didn't know that he fought tough man competitions before he started fighting pro. They say he was 15 years old knocking out grown men in these tough man competitions. But he had a rough you know a rough road growing up, as many boxers that they get in boxing. Boxing is one of those sports, like other sports too, but boxing is one of those sports where guys, that had trouble past, or as a youngster, kind of know where to go and not knowing what they want to do, and they usually turn to boxing because back then, it's boxing gyms all over the place. Now, it's very little. You can very seldom find a boxing gym. Most boxing gyms are integrated with the MMA scene, so you really never really find a pure boxing gym. But he started boxing. He said that his brothers and his uncles and grandfather boxed, so he had a history of boxing in his family. But Tommy Morrison, he may not. I don't think he was a great fighter. He was a good fighter, but you know, he beat George. Well, he lost to Ray Mercer, and I remember seeing that fight on replay. I didn't see it when it aired, but I seen it on replay, and I was like, oh, okay, this the dude, that was in Rocky. I mean, this the dude that was in Rocky, because I seen the fight, the Ray Mercer fight, maybe in like 95, 96, and that's my first time seeing the fight. And Rocky 5 was like what, 93, 92. So I seen this fight like years after it happened. And I was like, man, this is a dude that played in Rocky. So I watched the fight, and it was over in like 5 or 6 rounds. But you know, Tommy Morrison came out, winning the fight. And the backstory to that fight actually was that Ray Mercer and his camp thought that Tommy Morrison was taking steroids, and then Tommy Morrison manager confirmed that he was taking steroids. He said that he told Tommy Morrison that he needed, but Tommy Morrison, he was a guy that was undisciplined outside of the ring. They said that he drunk a lot, messed around with a lot of women, didn't train properly, and I think he took the steroids as a buffer because he knew he wasn't in tip top shape, so he was trying to take it for an edge, trying to get a competitive edge. And Ray Mercer, they was at the weigh-in, and Ray Mercer said, in his camp, looked at him and said, "Look, all that acne on his back. He's on steroids." So I found that interesting that that Ray Mercer went on. I mean, because it was no drug test for it back then, so he couldn't come out and say, "Well, I think this man on steroids" without proof. But he said that they were talking over the fight the night before the fight, and they said that he got about 5 rounds before he wear out, because steroids is a short burst energy booster. Once when you take it, you feel like Superman, but once it wear off, you feel, you don't even feel normal. You feel worse than normal. So Tommy Morrison did come out winning the fight. I mean, he was hitting Ray Mercer, got a chin, man, because he was hitting Ray Mercer with some shit. He was hitting Ray Mercer with some knockout shots, man. But Ray Mercer ended up catching him in the corner, man. That's probably the most brutal combination punches I've ever seen. Because when he hit him with that first punch, Tommy Morrison backed up to the ropes, and then he hit him again, and his body just went limp, but he didn't fall. And the referee was out of place, and Ray Mercer just teed off on him with like 3 or 4 clean open shots, man. Drilled that dude. That was bad. The referee should have been fired, man. But anyway, he did come back and beat George Foreman for the vacant WBO title, and then he lost to this one dude he lost to. I have no idea who that dude was, but he lost to that dude. Lost to a dude named Michael Bennett. He had fought in his hometown. It was supposed to have been a stay busy fight before he fought Lennox Lewis, and his manager said that they didn't want to go into the Lennox Lewis fight unprepared, because Tommy Morrison only trained when he had a fight. So they were trying to keep him busy in training camp in between the Lennox Lewis fight and the George Foreman fight, just to keep him in shape and keep him, from drinking himself to a stupor, which he did that. He went out and drunk and lived the high life, the party life. You can't do that when you're a fighter, man. That stuff catches up with you. Boxing is one of those true sports that, and any athlete can't do that, but boxing, really, man, that's your life. That's your life, that when you go in there in that square circle, man, you can lose your life, and it's not funny. It's not a game, But he lost in his hometown. The guy caught him with a nice shot and knocked him out in the first round. And after that, his manager said, Bob Arum left. Everybody, all the sponsors left, because they didn't want to deal with him no more because he was unreliable. And the dude said the night before that fight, he went out and was drinking, and he didn't even train for that fight. Even the fight that he was trying to keep him busy, he didn't even train for the stay busy fight, which is crazy, man, in itself. But he said he managed to secure a deal with Don King, a 5-fight deal or how many fights. At the end of the deal, it was going to lead to the Tyson fight. So he wanted Don King to rebuild Tommy Morrison, and then the climax was to fight Mike Tyson. But then before he had his first fight under Don King promotion, he tested positive for the AIDS virus, and he couldn't fight. So then that's when it went downhill from there. He just went to a spiral and never recovered. He fought a couple more times, but I don't know how he fought those times. I don't know how they cleared him to fight those times, because in the U.S. he was supposed to have been banned from fighting. But I remember Tommy Morrison doing an interview. It was like 2010 or 11 or something like that. And he said he said he never had AIDS, and he don't think he has AIDS. And it was a conspiracy or something, and I don't know. I think he was in denial. A lot of his, family and manager thought he was in denial. And man, it was a tragic story at the end. He had a rise to where when nobody knew him before the Rocky films, but his career was already started before Rocky even came out. But that film catapulted him to the public's eye, and he really could have. Tommy Morrison really could, if he would have dedicated himself and trained and lived the life of a fighter, discipline wise, he probably could have went down as one of the best heavyweights of his era. That was a tough era. Had Ray Mercer, George Foreman, Mike Tyson, Lennox Lewis. He ended up fighting Lennox Lewis, by the way, and lost in what 3 or 4 rounds, something like that. But yeah, he could have been one of the best fighters of a tough era. That was a tough era he was in. He lost 3 times. All his losses were by knockout, but he had an exciting style. He had a knockout style. He had a come forward grit. He had a pretty nice chin. You know, he got knocked out 3 times. That's a heavyweight division for you, but it was some fights that I seen that he took some pretty hellacious punches, man, and just kept coming. He was a tough dude, man. He wasn't a great fighter defensive wise, but offensive wise, he was really good. I mean, he could have beat anybody. He was a threat to beat anybody. As a matter of fact, he was a threat to beat anybody, I should say. But I would have loved to see him versus Mike Tyson. That would have been an interesting fight because this wouldn't have been Mike Tyson of the '80s. This would have been the Mike Tyson of the mid '90s. That was not the fighter of the early '90s and the mid '80s. This was a different Tyson. This wasn't the bob and weave Tyson. This was more of, you know, standing in front of you flat-footed Tyson. And that would have been an interesting fight, man. That would have been an interesting fight. That's 50-50. Now the Tyson that moved and bobbed and weaved, I would have gave Tyson the fight. But the mid-90s Tyson versus Tommy Morrison would have been interesting. I wouldn't have been surprised if Tommy Morrison would have beat Tyson, would have knocked Tyson out. I wouldn't be surprised if Tyson would have knocked him out. I would have loved to see that fight, man. That would have been a classic fight. They probably would not have been the same. Their careers probably would have been over after that because they would have been landing some bombs, man. Tyson was still explosive. He wasn't a bobber and the mover and with the hand speed or the footwork, but he was still a great fighter. He was still a great offensive fighter. He was still a threat to knock you out. Tommy Morrison, the same, was still a threat to knock you out. He was a great offensive fighter, had an array of punches, and it would have been a great fight, man. It was you know, Tommy Morrison died in 2013 from complications of the AIDS virus. It was a sad ending to the man's life, man. But now his sons fight. I know his 2 sons fight, and I think Freddie Roach trains one of them. And you know, Freddie Roach said his son has a one-punch knockout power. It's interesting. It would be interesting to see what they do. I think one of them is a heavyweight. One of them look really big, so I think he's a heavyweight. The other one kind of slender. I think he maybe be a middleweight, or even maybe be a light heavyweight. But you know, I'm gonna follow their careers and see what they accomplish and see what they can do. This is Boxing Talk 8576. Let me know what you think about Tommy Morrison. If you even remember Tommy Morrison, or were you looking at boxing back then? I wasn't looking at boxing heavy back then. Back then I was heavy in football and basketball, but I occasionally looked at boxing with my uncle. My uncle always was watching boxing back then. That's how I got on Tito Trinidad, through my uncle. He loved him my Uncle Butch loved him some Tito Trinidad, man. But yeah, this is Boxing Talk 8576. I'm out.